Our next speaker is Dr. Shareit Kofman-Simchon, born in Iași, Romania, educated in Israel and the US, currently living in Jerusalem, teaching theater at Kibboutzim College in Tel Aviv and Emuna College in Jerusalem, holds a PhD in theater arts from the University of Minnesota. Main fields of research: Judaism and theater, theater in Jewish history, Moroccan and Ethiopian theater in Israel. Has published essays in journals and books in Israel and the US, and is currently completing her book on the Israeli-Ethiopian theater. The essay presented at this conference is part of a larger project for which she was awarded a research grant from the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and the title of her presentation is Imagine Apostasy of Belle Juive in English Renaissance Drama.
Hi. The title of my presentation is Imagined Apostasy of Belle Juive in English Renaissance Drama. I would like to start with a quote from Haviva Levin's book, Jewish Conversion to Christianity in Medieval Northern Europe. Christian medieval images of idealized Jewish conversions center on young Jewish boys or young virginal Jewish women and raise intriguing questions about how Christians construe Jewish and gender identity. Unquote. One of the most brutal forms of cultural interchange was the coerced conversion of Jews to Christianity that was rife during the Middle Ages. However, in Renaissance English plays, beautiful young Jewesses are portrayed as prone to eagerly choose conversion out of free conviction. In William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, Shylock's punishment is to convert, whereas his daughter Jessica, sick of the atmosphere in her father's house, elopes with a Christian lover and willingly converts to Christianity. I would like to foreground the trope of La Belle Juive's apostasy in English Renaissance drama by focusing on three texts. The Croxton play of the Sacrament from 1460, The Jew of Malta from 1589, and The Merchant of Venice 1596. Mine is a work in process, and in fact this is my first draft. Needless to say, at the time of these plays, following the explosion of 1290 and prior to the permission to resettle that was granted them in the mid-17th century, only a few Jews lived in England. The texts deal, in fact, with imagined apostasy. Regardless of their absence, the Jews had a real presence as a symbol. The question of Jewish apostasy was instrumental in Renaissance England as part of its identity construction, given the tension between Catholics and Protestants. The plays touch upon a number of aspects of what the turning of the Jews meant in England. Surprisingly little has been written on this subject, given evidence that shows the extraordinary interest Elizabeth had in the conversion of the Jews, an interest intensified by religious controversies that produced a crisis of faith, the severity of which, it was hoped, Jewish conversion might somehow alleviate. The fantasy of Jews rejecting their own beliefs in favor of Christian ones was so strong that it gave rise to story of deathbed confessions by rabbis. English medieval theater tended to focus on religion. The plays, anonymously written, could be categorized either as morality, mystery, or miracle plays. Mystery plays dealt with representation of Bible stories, such as the Passion. Miracle plays presented a real or fictitious account of the life, miracles, or martyrdom of saint. And morality plays tried to prompt the Christians to choose a godly life over one of evil. The Jew in medieval theater had mostly an allegoric role in morality plays, and many times he or she chose a godly, meaning Christian life. In order to analyze the representation of Jewish conversion, it is instrumental to start with the Croxton play of the Sacrament that functions as the ur-drama of Jews' apostasy representation in England, even though no daughters are involved in it. The author of the play of the Sacrament is unknown. The plot is paradigmatic. The Jew Jonathan, who lives in Aragon, offers money and some merchandise to a Christian merchant in exchange for a consecrated host, stolen from a local church. Jonathan and his Jewish accomplices begin to crucify the host by pinning it to a pillar in order to disprove the doctrine of transubstantiation. then boiling it in a cauldron of oil, then putting it in an oven which later explodes. The image of Christ appears to the Jews. They repent of their sins. The bishop then baptizes the Jews who live to travel the world expiating their wickedness. In this case, they chose to convert thanks to the miracle they had witnessed, and the Christian happy end has obviously theological significance. However, no gender-oriented innuendos are involved. Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, on the other hand, deals with the Christian-ruled island of Malta, claimed by the Turks. The governor, his purse too small to meet the Turks' demands for tribute, demands that Barabbas, Malta's richest Jew, cede his wealth to the cause and furthermore turns his mansion into a nunnery. And of course, Barabbas is his name symbolically. From that moment on, Barabbas is bent on revenge. He makes his daughter Abigail pose as a nun to steal back his hidden fortune and causes the man she loves, the governor's son, to be killed in a duel with another suitor. Learning of her father's ugly duplicity, the daughter converts to Christianity and rejoins the convent where her father sent his slave, Itamar, with a poisoned gift. All the nuns, including Abigail, are poisoned. The plot thickens and eventually Barabbas is executed, cursing mankind with his last breath. Considered as a forerunner of The Merchant of Venice, the play presents the gender and generation-oriented dichotomy between father and daughter. Whereas Barabbas is a cruel murderer yet a faithful Jew, his daughter is just the opposite. Innocent and immaculate, she decides to desert ugly Judaism embodied by her cruel father. In addition, she has a Christian lover, a detail of major importance. Finally, in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, Shylock is a Jewish moneylender who agrees to lend money to Bassanio on the credit of Antonio, Shylock's Christian rival. Shylock, suspicious of Antonio, the merchant of Venice, sets the security as a pound of Antonio's flesh. When Antonio's merchant's ventures fail and he cannot come up with the money to pay off the loan, Shylock demands the pound of flesh, which he will surely kill Antonio. Shylock insists that his debt be paid. He wants revenge on Antonio, as the latter loans money without charging interest, thus making Shylock lose business. He had spat on Shylock, verbally and physically abused him, turned his friends against him, and inflamed his enemies toward him. Shylock became obsessed with collecting his debt because of his grief. His only daughter, Jessica, has fled his house, taking his money and jewels to elope with Antonio's friend Lorenzo and convert to Christianity. At a Venetian court, the Duke presides over the sentencing hearing of Antonio. Even though Bassanio offers repayment, Shylock refuses. He is himself found guilty of a crime, namely conspiring to kill another citizen, Antonio. As a punishment, the Duke and Antonio decide that Shylock must give half his belongings to the court, keep the other half for himself, and promise to give all his remaining belongings to his daughter and son-in-law, Lorenzo, upon his death, and become a Christian. With no other choice, Shylock agrees. Hiram Maccabee argues that Shakespeare's play is based on medieval morality plays, in which the Virgin Mary argues for the forgiveness of human souls as against the implacable accusations of the devil, Shylock. The same could be argued of The Jew of Malta and the play of the Sacrament. They all function as morality plays. Moreover, all three plots take place in a Mediterranean setting: Aragon, Malta, Venice, presumably because in the English imagination, Jews belong there and not in England. However, there is an additional rationale for this sunny choice, at least as far as Shakespeare is concerned. The Merchant of Venice is considered a comedy, and as such, it shares the common features of Shakespearean comedies: a struggle of young lovers to overcome difficulty, often presented by elders; a happy ending, usually involving marriages between the unmarried characters; deception among characters, especially mistaken identity; a clever servant; disputes between characters, often within a family; multiple intertwining plots; and of course, a sunny place in the Mediterranean. Illyria in The Twelfth Night, Italy in Much Ado About Nothing, Greece in A Midsummer Night's Dream, etc. The representation of the young Jewess and her conversion functions alongside a peculiar aspect of gender betrayal. As James Shapiro indicates, quote, conversion is not quite the same for Jewish women as for Jewish men. In the world of fiction, the marriage and conversion of Jewish women will usually go hand in hand. Unquote. As Jessica puts it, she will become a Christian and Lorenzo's loving wife. In contrast, Jewish men who convert to Christianity are never married off to Christian women. And where Jewish women are always depicted as young and desirable, male Jewish converts are invariably old and impotent, condemned to remain unwed and at the periphery of the Christian community. To early modern Englishmen, the fantasy, and it must be a fantasy since there were no Jews in England, of Christian men marrying converting Jewesses was far more appealing than the idea of Jewish men, even converted ones, marrying Christian women. It almost sees that the imagined apostasy of Jewish daughters was more erotically motivated than theologically, intended to enable coupling with young Belle Juive than to reinforce Christianity, be it Catholic or Protestant, by means of a morality play. It is worth noting that there were English laws dating back to the 13th century, technically in effect 3 centuries later, that condemned to death Christians who had sex with Jews and linking this activity to the comparable crimes of sodomy and bestiality. In the 1640s, Edward Coke once again made available the ancient law of England that if any Christian man did marry with a woman that was a Jew, or a Christian woman that married with a Jew, it was felony and the party so offending should be burnt alive. Thus, in order to marry a Jewish woman, they had to render her kosher, meaning to convert her to Christianity. Why was it so important to deal with marrying Jewish women in the first place? Because when they willingly desert father and Judaism, they proved them both wrong and ugly. Morality play. For centuries, marriage outside of the religion is the ultimate betrayal for Jewish people. In Fiddler on the Roof, when Tevi's daughter gets married to a Gentile out of love and not out of disgust for her religion and father, for Tevi it is a very serious blow. According to the Jewish traditions, he declares her dead and forbids anyone of the family to have contact with her. Secretly, he still cares for her and learns at second-hand how she is doing. On one occasion, both meet on the street, but Tevi forces himself to ignore her. Similarly, Shylock's grief when his daughter elopes brings him to say, quote, "I would my daughter were dead at my foot," unquote. Second, as it turns out, even though non-existent in England, the Jewish woman functions as a particular object of desire to the degree of obsession. The portrayal of beautiful young Jewish women as exceptionally desirable candidates for conversion involves erotic emotions, or in Ronnie Sia's words, this is a union of conversion polemics and sexual fantasy, reflecting Jewish women's exoticism and attraction for Christian men. Indeed, the Belle Juive motif in Western literature and painting is loaded with exotic, orientalist, and even diabolic innuendos. As a femme fatale, John Gross writes that for an example of the depth of that an ungentle Jewess could stoop to, we might consider the ballads inspired by the death of little Hugh of Lincoln in 1255, and by the accusations of ritual murder which followed. The affair, which cost 18 Jews their lives, remained a vivid popular memory for hundreds of years, and the folklore which sprang up around it included the belief that the boy had been lured to his death by a Jew's daughter. In one version of the story from Scotland, he is described as accidentally throwing his ball through a window and trying to get it back from the Jew's daughter garden. The woman entices the boy into the house and slaughters him. The Jewess as temptress and potential murderess, given the way the Jewish women were portrayed, such an image is not to be wondered at. What is surprising, on the other hand, is how early a rival legend emerged. Stories about the love of a Christian youth for a Jewess can be found in collections of preachers' tales, the so-called exempla from the 13th century onwards, and the women in them who often end up being converted to Christianity tend to be shown in a favorable light. the French writer Chateaubriand, inspired by the example of Rebecca in Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, puzzled over the question of why the women of the Jewish race are more beautiful than the men. The answer he came up with was that Christ had been denied and crucified by the men of Judea alone, while the women believed in him, loved him, comforted him in his affliction. The rebellious daughter myth has its origin, says Leslie Fiedler, in, quote, the dogmatic compromise by which Christianity managed to make the New Testament its scripture without surrendering the old, unquote. The transition from the old order to the new order is typical of comedies, and in this place it turns emblematic. To conclude, as Hunter rightly observes, theology is central to the analysis of the early modern theatricalization of Jews because of the long and tortuous tradition of interpreting Christianity adversus Judaeos, that is, in opposition to Judaism. The English Reformation complicated Christians' response to Jews by offering an unqualified promise of conversion within a discourse shaped by the oppositional rhetoric of anti-Judaism. Further, the problem of the Jew in Christian England intersected with an emerging ideology of race, to affirm a notion of English identity in which color, religion, and class converged. The Belle Juive constitutes a diversion from this agenda due to her or extraordinary, even if imaginary, attractiveness. Thank you. And I would like to show you a fragment from The Merchant of Venice, if I can find it. A question? No, sorry. Thank you. I'm trying to get it.
Times lest the devil cross my prayer, for here he comes in the likeness of a Jew. Hello, Shylock. What news among the merchants?
It's Laurence Olivier.
You knew none so well. None so well as you. What my daughters learned.
That's certain. I, for my part, knew the tailor that made the wings she flew withal.
And Shylock, for his own part, knew the bird was fledged, and then it is the complexion of them all to leave the dam. She is damned for it.
That's certain, if the devil may be her judge.
I am flesh and blood to revolt. Out upon it, old carrion. Revolts it of these years. I say, my daughter is my flesh and blood.
There is more difference between thy flesh and hers than between jet and ivory. More between your bloods than there is between red wine and reddish. But tell us, do you hear whether Antonio have had any loss?
Hey! A bad match, a bankrupt, a prodigal, that dares to show his head in the Rialto! A beggar that was used to come so smug upon the mart! To call me usurer. Let him look to his bond. He was used to lend out monies for Christian courtesy. Let him look to his bond.
I'm sure if he thought it, thou would not take his flesh.
Okay. Thank you.